Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and as the title would suggest, today I'm going to be covering electric motor braking. I'm going to show the basics of how it works, the basics of the wiring. I'm going to go over how it's used in stock blasters, and then I'll touch on the debate that exists on whether or not it should be used in modified blasters. I'm not an electrician, so I don't know the gritty details of that, but I will present the advantages and disadvantages that I've heard, and then kind of my own take on them, and you can take away from it what you will. I encourage you to do your own research and come to your own conclusions. I will be starting with the very basics of electric motors, which I probably should have covered in a previous video, but we'll go over it here for those of you that are genuinely new to motors. An electric motor is obviously a motor that is powered using an electric current. In Nerf blasters, we use batteries, which have a positive and a negative. When you connect up the positive to one pole on the motor and the negative to the other, it will spin in one direction. If you switch which ones you have it connected to, the motor will spin in the opposite direction, which is useful in some cases. Now, in a normal circuit, when you disconnect the circuit, the motor will slowly spin down because it has momentum, and there's nothing to stop that momentum other than the friction within the motor itself, and so it will slowly spin down, and this can cause problems in certain blasters. So we want it to come to an abrupt halt, and to do that we use electric motor braking, which is done simply by connecting a negative to both ends of the motor when you disconnect it. So when you disconnect the positive, you connect up a negative, and this will halt the motor. It'll also make it resistant to being rotated, which is useful in certain applications that we will see. In order to implement this in a useful manner, we are going to introduce a switch, which I've also covered in previous videos, and you can look those up. The circuit that I'm going to use as my example is in fact the wiring for any semi-automatic flywheel blaster. It is the circuit for the Barricade, the Strife, and all of the various clones and reshells that came after. And the stock circuit is really very simple. You have negative going to one pole on your motor. You have positive going to the normally open on the switch. And then your COM connects to the other pole on your motor. And that's all there is to it. Now when you press the switch, it completes the positive circuit to the motor, and the motor spins. When you release the switch, it disconnects the positive and the motor slowly spins down. That is the stock configuration. Now, all you have to do to implement electric braking on that motor is add one wire from the negative on the battery to the normally closed on the switch. And that is all there is to it. Now, when you press the switch, it completes the positive circuit and the motor spins, but when you release the switch, it now completes a negative circuit to the other end of the motor. Having negative on both halts the motor using electric braking, but you need to make sure that you have it correctly because you have introduced a second negative line, and if you don't do it correctly, you can short out your battery, and if you're using a LiPo, it can explode. So, you need to make sure that the positive and the negative are going to the normally open and normally closed. Neither of the leads from the battery should be to COM. COM needs to be the one that goes to the motor. Because if you were to switch the COM with the positive, now the moment you plug it in, you have completed the circuit from the negative to positive and you're going to blow up your battery. If you had negative and COM switched, then as soon as you actually push the button, you're just going to connect negative and positive and blow up your battery. So, COM goes to the motor. The normally open goes to the positive. Normally closed goes to the negative. It should be fairly straightforward, but if you get this wrong, it can create a catastrophic failure. So be very careful anytime you have more than one negative line anywhere in your system. Electric motor braking is used in a number of stock blasters to make sure that the internal mechanisms stop when they're supposed to. The best examples that I have are the Stampede and the Rapid Strike. These both are fully automatic blasters, of course, but they're designed so that if you pull the trigger and immediately release it, the gun completes one full firing rotation before then stopping. And in order to do this, there is a switch on the inside that once the gun starts firing, that switch is engaged and keeps the circuit connected until the blaster has completed one full rotation. That way, it doesn't stop halfway in between because you released the trigger. That switch makes sure that the circuit is connected until the rotation is complete, and then that switch, once that switch is released, it engages the electric motor brake so that the motor halts, and it doesn't allow it to continue and re-engage that switch, because that would make it do another rotation, and if that loop continued, that is where you get runaway in both of these blasters. The electric motor brake is what stops the runaway, is what is preventing it. So that is where it is useful in fully automatic blasters. The place where electric motor braking is still debated is in whether or not you should implement it on your flywheel motors. Advantages and disadvantages are still debated. The advantages that most people put forth is that it's quieter. Since the motors come to an abrupt halt, there's less residual noise, and in an HVZ or some situation where stealth would be very important, maybe that would be an advantage. Given how much noise the blaster already makes, I would argue how actual advantageous that is, but I've never played an HVZ where I needed to be stealthy, so perhaps those who have could weigh in and say that no, yes, having it shut off gives me a little bit of extra time of quiet where I can run, or what have you. The disadvantage is in heat. In order to stop something that's running at that RPM, because we use high RPM motors, we use high torque motors, bringing that to an abrupt halt requires energy, and that energy gets dissipated in the form of heat. And any additional heat to an electric system is going to cause damage over time. How much damage? I have no idea. That is something you'd need to talk to an electrician about, or the designers of the motors, or people who know a lot more about it than I do. But there is going to be heat, and halting the motors like that is going to cause wear and tear over time. The other place where it is in a disadvantage is then rev time, spin-up time, because you're always starting from a dead stop. Whereas normally it might still be slowing down when you go to rev it back up again, which means you don't have to use quite as much energy to get it up to a full speed because it started partially spinning. How much of a difference that's going to make in the high torque motors that we use nowadays, 180s and Rhinos and those sort of things where spin-up time is practically negligible anyway, I don't know. But I would also assume that going from a dead stop to spinning up is more wear and tear on a motor than going from a motor that's already partially spinning. So again, you've got wear and tear versus whatever advantages you see in the motors coming to a complete stop. Some people just really like that they come to a complete stop. They like the abruptness of it. And that's a perfectly reasonable reason if you feel that balances out the possible disadvantages. I don't feel it does, so I would never implement it on my own personal blasters, but I don't see it as enough of a disadvantage that I would ever discourage somebody who wanted it in a commission or who put it into their own. So it's something you can look up the debates, or you can weigh in on them, or if you know more about electronics, you'll have a better idea. But that's where it stands as far as I understand it. And that is, in fact, all I can really tell you about electric motor braking. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, if I have gotten something completely wrong and you feel that you need to point it out, go ahead and put that in the comments below. If at some point I said electronic motor braking instead of electric motor braking, I don't need to hear about that. Yes, there is a difference. Electronic is things that involve circuit boards and gates and more complicated things, whereas electric is what we're dealing with, which is just switches, if you've ever wondered the difference. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, things you would like to know more about, things you would like to hear about, go ahead and put them in the comments below. I hope all of the information in this is correct, and I hope it is helpful, and thank you for watching.